Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Bava Metzia Daf Tzadi Vav, but we're going to begin on Bava Metzia Tzadi Hey Amud Beis, 6 lines from the bottom, where the Gemara says, and Abaye and Rav are discussing how do we explain the idea that the Brisa said that we say that there's an exemption. Let me first say that today's daf is dedicated for Yeshua, for Am Yisrael, Hatzal for the Shvuyim, and the Shmira for the Chayalim. Now, we had learned in the Brisa that you're only responsible, that you're going to be exempt based on, if you borrow something, based on the principle of Bava of Imo, if the owner is with you. But this idea that you're exempt if the owner is with you, that's only if the owner is with you at the moment that you borrow the animal or the object. But if it was actually later on, if he was just working with you during the time that the animal died or that the utensil broke, then the exemption doesn't apply. The exemption only works at the moment if the owner is borrowed to you, at the owner you borrow the object. So the Gemara says on the bottom of 95b that Abaye and Rava argue about what's the source for this idea. Abaye Savra, the Gemara says that Abaye had a principle like Rabbi Yoshaya, Umetaretz l'kraik Rabbi Yoshaya. The Rava Savra like Rabbi Yonasan, Umetaretz l'kraik Rabbi Yonasan. Abaye bases it upon the fact that he holds like Rabbi Yoshaya, and he explains the psukim that says, if a person borrows something from his friend and breaks or dies, like Rabbi Yoshaya, to explain this principle. As Rava holds like Rabbi Yonasan, and therefore explains the psukim like Rabbi Yonasan. This refers to a debate that we had on 94b between Rabbi Yoshaya and Rabbi Yonasan with respect to the fact that it says in the verse, a man who curses his father and his mother shall be put to death. And what is the simple reading of that verse? So Rabbi Yoshaya says the simple reading of that verse is that you would require both to curse your mother and your father. And so therefore the pasuk comes and qualifies that you only need to curse one. Whereas Rabbi Yonah says the simple reading is that really only one of them is necessary. And so too by She'ela, the question is, do we need the Bava of Imo by both times, by the borrowing and the using, or just by one of them? So Abaye Sarvak Rabbi Yoshia, he says that the simple reading is that both of them are required. And Mataratz l'kraik Rabbi Yoshia, and therefore he explains the psukim like Rabbi Yoshia. Ba'alav eini mo shalem mishalem. It says if the owner is not with him, he has to pay. Meaning to say, time delays to betravel, because he's not with him by both of them. So if he would be with him by one and not by the other one, he would be exempt, pater. But it says if the owner is with him, he shall. So, and we could question that, but it says if the owner is with him, he should not pay. Time of the Isa B'Travail, he's with him with both of them. Isa B'Chad, the voice B'Chad Machayev. He's only with him one is responsible. So it's to tell you that if he's with him at the time of the borrowing, he doesn't need to be with him at the time of the accident. But if he was with him at the time of the accident, still would still need to be with him at the time of the borrowing. Whereas Rava Savra like Rabbi Yonasan, Rava hold on top of 96a, Rava holds like Rabbi Yonasan, Mataratz l'kraik Rabbi Yonasan, and he explains the psukim like Rabbi Yonasan. The Tanya and Ba'alav Imo lo yishalem says if the owner is with him, he shall not pay. Mashma de Isa b'Travayu, that implies if he has to be with him by both. Mashma nami dechi Isa b'Chad the Potter also implies that if he's with him by one and exempt by the other one, he's exempt. And then it says if the owner is not with him, he must pay, which implies mashma d'leisa b'travayu, that he has to not be by either one. That if he's only with him by one, he's responsible. So to tell you, that if he's with him at the time of the borrowing, and if he's with him at the borrowing, he doesn't need to be with him at the time of the accident. If he's with him at the time of the accident, it needs to be with him at the time of the borrowing. So the Gemara says, but wait, the Gemara just puts a code on this. Why do we say that the time that he has to be with him is at the time of the borrowing? Maybe the time that he has to be with him is at the time of the accident. So the Gemara says, no, we don't say that. No, we say that the exemption is only if he's with him at the time of the borrowing, because that's where the borrower gets into his possession. Or it says the other, just the opposite. No, the accident is better. That's where he becomes responsible for the accidents. The Gemara says, no, if there's no borrowing, what would happen by the accident? And if there was no accident, then what would be the case of the borrowing? So the Gemara says still, the time of the borrowing is considered to be the essential time. That's where he's responsible for supporting the animal, for feeding the animal, so therefore that's the essential time. Before we go on to the next piece, Rav Ashi gives a different source for the idea that the essential time where the owner needs to be with you is at the time of the borrowing and not at the time of the accident. Rav Ashi says it's based upon a pasuk. Rav Ashi Amar Kravach Yishal Ishmi Imre'eo. The person borrows it from his friend, meaning to say, says Rav Ashi, if a person borrows it from his friend, and the words Me'imre'eu are presumably extra, it could just say V'chiyishal ish, and we would obviously understand that it's from his friend. So what do we do, Me'imre'eu? Meaning to say, only if he borrows the object and his friend is not with him is he responsible. Shalem shalem. Hare'eu imo pater. But if the owner is with him at the time that he borrows it, then he would be exempt. So what do we do with the fact that it says the owner is not with him, he has to pay, which implies, and then it says in Bava Metzia, and then it says in the next verse, if the owner is with him, he doesn't pay. Why do we need it? The says, no, we love Hanach. If we didn't have that, the next psukim have Amina, Hai Orche Dekra. We would just say it's a typical way of speaking. Okay, so now we're up to another series of questions. Gemara is going to give some a little bit far-fetched scenarios, and we want to know if these principles about borrowing apply. And it's not exactly clear what the Gemara's question here is. Dispute about the Rishonim. Are they asking about borrowing in general, or the exemptions when the owner is with him? So that's in the chokas amongst the Rishonim. So, but we'll just read the Gemara straight. Let's say a person borrows the animal in order to have bestiality with it. What would be the law? Do we say, do the laws of borrowing apply? Do we say that the laws of borrowing apply only when you borrow it in a typical manner? And in this case, you didn't borrow it in a typical manner. Odoma, meaning most people don't borrow it. Odoma, time of my mishamana. Or do we say that the laws of borrowing apply because you get benefit? In this case, he has benefit from it. Let's say you borrow the animal just so that you could look like a wealthy man, and you're not going to actually use it. You just want people to look like you're a wealthy man, so people give you money on credit, etc. Do we say mamona ba'ina va'ika? Then, or if the laws of borrowing apply, you need to have money, and there is money. Odama mamona de'iso anamine ba'inan. No, or you need to have benefit in order the laws of borrowing to apply v'leka, and there's no benefit. So next question, Sheila Sospa Pachas Mipruta. Let's say you borrowed it to work it less than a coin. Do we say Mao Mamona Ba'ina Vika? We say you're required to use it for money, and there is money there. Odoma Kol Pachas Mipruta or less than a penny is not considered money. Next question. Let's say you borrowed 2 cows, and together you're going to do a pruta. Do we say Miamrina and Zilbas or Shoel Mashil? We follow, look at the borrower and the lender, and there's a pruta. Or we look at each individual cow. In each individual cow, there's no money. So again, we leave that question unresolved. Next question. Shalmi Shutfin. Let's see, borrow from 2 partners. And one of the partners ends up working for you. Do we say Ma'u Kulo Bawa? And then in order to say the exemption of the owner is with you, we need the whole owner. And the whole owner is not here. Or do we say at least from the half of that owner, he should at least be exempt? Something happens because the exemption of the owner is with him. Next case, Shutfin Sheshalu. Let's say partners borrowed it, partners borrow it, and then the owner of the object lent himself to one of them. So therefore, we say that we say he needs to be lent to the entire borrowing force, and that doesn't exist. And that's not here. Maybe at least the person he lent himself to, that one should at least be exempt. Now, the next case, Shalmei Aisha, let's say you borrow from a woman. You borrow something from a woman, and the husband is lent to the person. Or Isha Shashala, or a woman who borrows it, Vinishal, or a woman who borrowed something, Vinishal Abal, and the owner of the object lent himself to her husband. Do we say, now, generally speaking, what we're talking about here is what's called a woman brings into her marriage something called, she can designate her property however she wants when she comes into a marriage. In this case, we're talking about what's called Nilchse Malug. Nilchse Malug is property the woman brings into marriage. she owns the principal, she retains the principal, but the husband has the rights to the product and the dividends while they're married. And so therefore, do we say in this case, kinyan peros, kinyan aguftami? And since the husband has the rights to the fruits, it's as though he owns the essential property itself, and so therefore the husband's like the owner, and so therefore it's like it's his. Or do we say kinyan peros, lav kinyan aguftami? Or do we say it's not like you own it if you just had the fruits? So now, before the Gemara answers that question, I'm going to introduce another question. Somebody says to his agent, say v'hasheli imparasi, go. And so he says, so somebody goes and says to his agent, say v'hasheli imparasi. He says, go and basically go and lend yourself out for me with my cow, meaning to say, I want to lend my cow. And I'm not lending myself out with the cow, but I want you to lend yourself out with the cow. Do we say Bava Mamish, but you know that in order to have the exemption of the owner being with him, we need to have the actual owner, and that's not here. Odoma shulcha shel adam kamoso. Or do we say no, or do we say the agent to the person, shulcha shel adam kamoso ve'ika? Or do we say the agent to the person is like shulcha shel adam kamoso? Or do we say the agent is like the actual person, and so therefore it's going to have the exemption of the owner being with him? But so he says, so he says the Baal, the question about the husband, if the husband is going to be considered like he lent himself out when his wife was his wife's property, that's a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. And the case of the shliach, in the case of the agent, that's the pukta to Rabbi Yonasan and Rabbi Yoshaya. That's the dispute between Rabbi Yonasan and Rabbi Yoshaya. So the husband is the pukta of Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, because we said Baal pukta to Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. The idmar, because we learned as it relates to the mitzvah of bikurim. So what's the mitzvah of bikurim? You're supposed to take your first fruits, bring them up to the temple, and when you get to the temple, you have to say a passage from the beginning of Parshas Kitavo. The land that you gave to me, I'm grateful to. And you give the whole story. Arami Ovidavi. You see, Adama Asher Nasatli. But let's say you don't own the land, you just own the fruits. Do we say that it's still your land to say this? So the Gemara says, Adama Asher Nasatli. So if you just own the fruits, so Rabbi Yochanan Amar Mevi Vikora. So if somebody owns the fruits only, but not the field, Rabbi Yochanan says Mevi Vikora. Rish Lakish Amar Mevi Veinokara. Rabbi Yochanan says you bring the fruits and you recite the Bikurim. And Rish Lakish says you bring them and you don't recite that Bikurim. So Rabbi Yochanan is saying kinyan aperos, just because you own the fruits, you don't own the essential land. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Mevi Vikora, kinyan aperos, kinyan aguftami. It's like you own the fruits. Whereas Rish Lakish says you own the land. Whereas Rish Lakish says maybe veinokara, kinyan aperos lav kinyan aguftami. Just because you own the fruits, you don't own the land. And so too, like the husband, even though he owns the rights to the fruits, he doesn't own the land. And so therefore, if he lends himself out, it's not like the owner is working with the object. Whereas the shliach is the pukta to Rabbi Yonasan and Rabbi Yoshaya. The agent is like the dispute between Rabbi Yonasan and Rabbi Yoshaya. I mean to say, where you lend out your cow with your agent with it, that's a dispute between Rabbi Yonasan and Rabbi Yoshaya. The Tanya Omer La Petropis. Somebody says to his executor, Kol Nadarim Shetahei Ishi Nodaris Mikana Chavo Mimakom Poni Haferla. So we learned this in the Dharm that if a person is going on a trip and he says to his assistant, his secretary, and all the vows that my wife will make, from now until I come to this place, I want you to reject these vows. And he annuls her vows. And I might think the agent has the right to annul her vows. That's the verse. No, only the husband can do it. That's the position of Rabbi Yoshaya. Whereas Rabbi Yonasan says, so the agent is always like this person. The question is, do we view the agent as literally just standing for the husband, or just like a representative? So according to Rabbi Yonasan, the agent is a full representative, and so therefore the agent is Baal Avimo, he's working with him, and so therefore those exemptions would apply. So whereas Rabbi Yoshaya says, no, the agent is not the husband. He might be able to have the authority to act like the husband there, but he's not the husband to annul her vows. So too as it relates to Baal Avimo. So the Gemara says, wait, I'm really Rav Ilish or Ravha. Let's say a person says to a servant or a slave, go out and loan yourself out with my cow. Do we say that that's going to be considered like the owner is with him? So it goes. It's a question both of Ram Yonas and Ram Yeshai. It's a question of whether or not, according to both, whether or not you say the agent as the equivalent of the initial person. So it's a question according to one who says the agent is like the exact person. So meaning to say, that's by an agent to bar mitzvah, because the agent himself is capable of doing mitzvos. But the slave, the lav bar mitzvah, the slave is not capable of doing mitzvos, then we wouldn't say this. Even according to the one who says that an agent in general is not like the original owner, that's by an agent of Eved, but a slave, Yav Eved Yad Rabbi Odami. A slave is actually a higher level than a regular agent. The hand of a slave is literally an extension of the hand of the master. And so even though in general a slave would not, an agent would not be able to serve the place of the master to say Baal of Imo, the owner is with him, but a slave would be able to, because we have this principle that Yad Eved Ki Yad Rabbo Dami, that the hand of a slave is like the hand of a master. In this case, we're saying that a slave, in this context, is a higher level. You're like essentially part of the original source. And this is, we can learn this on a symbolic level because we want to be Eved Hashem, a servant of God. And so therefore, when we act like a servant of God, a slave to Hashem, then we are basically an extension of Hashem. We say it's logical to assume that the hand of a slave is like the hand of the master. So the Baal, husband, as relates to the assets of his wife, so now we're asking a question. A husband has the right to use his wife's assets. Like we said, this is called nichsei mulug, the wife's property while they're married. Do we view him as a borrower or do we view him as a renter? To say, why would we care? If he's a borrower, he's going to be liable for all accidents. But if he's a renter, he would not be liable for all accidents. We're on the top of 96b. The Gemara says, Amarava, fum chorfa shibashta. You're so smart, you messed it up. Meaning to say, because you're so smart, you messed up your question. This is also Musar Haskell for all of us. Sometimes we think we're so smart and we mess things up. Manav Shach. Doesn't make sense, your question. If he's a borrower, well, then he's borrowing this object with his wife there. So there it's considered to be ownership with the owner there, and he'd be exempt. If he's a renter, it's also a renter with the owner there, and he'd be exempt. So what was the question? What was the question that Rami Bar Chama asked? What was the question that Rami Bar Chama asked? The question Rami Bar Chama asked was, the agar mine para v'hadar nasba, that he borrows from her a cow and then he marries her. Do we say shohavi or socharavi? Is he, now that after he marries her, is he considered to be a borrower on the cow or a renter? Shohavi v'asya she'ela b'balim. Do we say now he's a borrower of the animal, and so therefore the borrowing comes and uproots the previous rental, which was done shalom without the owner present. Odilma socharavi, or perhaps we say he's a renter who's slirus kedekaimi. And the rental, why is he a renter if he borrows the object? Because he has certain responsibilities to pay her. If she's captured, he has to redeem her. It's his responsibility. Which is, of course, something heartbreaking to read, that we see that a husband's responsibility is to redeem his wife. Okay, so the Gemara says, so under this case, do we see her as if he rented the animal and then they got married, do we view him as a borrower or as a renter? So the Gemara says, again, why do we care? So if you want to say he's a borrower, the way that when they got married, the borrowing comes and uproots the earlier rental, which was done without the owner. But if he's also a renter, the later rental will come and uproot the earlier renter, which happened without the owner. So that can't be the question. So what was the question Rami Bar Chama asked? The wife rented a cow, just in general, but then she gets married. Aliba the Rabbanan, according to Rabbanan, would say Shom. So we had earlier this case in Bava Metzia where a person borrows a cow and then rents it out to somebody else, and then the cow is hurt by, basically, under those circumstances, where a person rents a cow and then lends it out to somebody else, and then the cow is destroyed by an accident. So the original renter doesn't have to pay because he's not responsible for accidents. Well, the question is, does the person who he lent it to, does he pay back the original renter or does he pay back the original owner? Now, the Rabbanan are of the position that the person who borrowed it has to pay to the renter, whereas the renter is exempt. So the renter makes money there, whereas Rabbi Yossi says, no, that the person who borrows it has to pay to the original owner. So in this case, the woman rented the cow and then she lent it, and then she got married to her husband. So the question is as follows: according to Rabbanan, who say that the money goes back to the original renter, the Amri Shalom Hashem Socher, that the borrower pays the original renter. It's not a question. For sure, when he gets married, he's married with the owner, and he therefore doesn't have to pay her back. It's a question according to Rabbi Yossi, who says he says the money goes back to the original owner. My shohavi, do we say he's a borrower and therefore he has to pay the original owner? Or he's a renter and he doesn't have to pay it back. Amarava, he says no, the owner is not a borrower or renter, he's a purchaser. And we're going to say from Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina, he's a purchaser. And so since he is a purchaser, Rashi says he's going to say that we're going to say that he is exempt. We're going to say is exempt because he's going to be. Tosfos says he's like an unpaid watch, and the Gemara says the Amar Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina ba'usha eskinu ha'isha shemachar b'nachsei mulud b'chay ba'al meisa ba'al motzi miyan al kukos. That the Nusha they instituted that the husband has the first rights to his wife's property. Basically, he's considered almost like a buyer, and so if she sells it while they're married, he has the right to purchase it and take it back from that other person. So so let's say the woman inherited assets while they're married, and then after she inherited the assets, there were sacred property amongst them. Who is the one who's considered to be misappropriating? So Rashi gives us the example. She inherited objects from her father, Mishanises, after she had gotten married. And with that money that she inherited was money belonging to the temple, but she didn't know that they were hektish money, and so therefore that's me'ilah. She didn't know it's hektish money. So the Rabbanan say that the husband inherits them because we say the husband always has the right to use the fruits, and so therefore he became like an agent with the sacred property, and so therefore the husband is the one who has committed the misappropriation. So therefore the husband is the one. So that's the question. So Rava says, what mi'uah have they done here? Limo Baal, do you want to say that the husband is the one who's done the misappropriation? Why? The husband doesn't want to get the thing that's prohibited. He doesn't want to acquire it. Timo'iyah, do you want to say she's the one who misappropriated also? She doesn't want to inherit the hektish. She doesn't want to inherit it. Nimel Bezdin, you want to say the court that gave it over to them, that they're the ones who have done the misappropriation, that they're the ones who made the mistake. Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Nimel Bezdin Shal Yisrael Shava Osador, the court of the Jews in that generation, Shekol Takanos Mishpat Tuyabahen. All of the reforms and judgment are dependent upon them. And through them, all the laws and the judgments come forth from them. And it's as though they were quiet and allowed this kinyan. And so therefore, they're the ones who did the mistake. Do we want to say that the court is the one that made a mistake? The husbands did, the court didn't, the rabbis didn't say that the court has the right to hand over the hektish. They only have the right to hand over the non-hektish property. The husband will commit the me'ilah once he uses it. It's like somebody who moves the money from hektish to chulin. So he hasn't done it yet. He is basically, while the money's still bundled up, he hasn't acquired them. And so it's only when he uses them then that he's acquired them. Ask another question. Let's say you borrow an animal, and the animal gets weaker because you worked it. do we say there is the owner is the borrower responsible? What would be the law? Well, if you say he's responsible, then if the animal would die while you borrow the cow to plow the field, and then while you're plowing it, the cow dies, you would say that the owner is responsible. Nema lav lukma bekilta. Nema lav lukma bekilta shelter. Why is the borrower responsible? Why does it say I didn't borrow the animal to stick it in the barn? I borrowed it to use it. I borrowed it to use it, and if it died while I'm using it, why am I responsible? So we're seeing from here that this is the second exemption that the borrower has. One is if the owner is with him, and second, if he borrowed it and was using it in the normal manner, he's also exempt. Not only if the animal gets weak as a result of its typical job are you exempt. That even if the animal dies as a result of the normal typical use, you're also going to be exempt. Because he says I didn't borrow it to place it in the shed. I borrowed it to use it. And indeed, that's the halacha. There's a person who borrowed an axe from his friend. The axe broke. Also coming to Rav, so he says, bring witnesses that you use it in a typical manner and you'll be exempt. If there's no witnesses, what should you say? Under that law, if there's no witnesses, what will be that law? So the Gemara is going to go into that, but for now, we'll stop here. If anyone has any questions, happy to address. Yashakoach.